charitable works during the famine.
They call it God's famine. No, God's famine is known by the general scarcity of food, which is its consequences. There is no general scarcity, but political economy, finding Ireland too poor to buy the produce of its own labor, exported that harvest to a better market and left the people to die of famine.
When mothers and fathers saw their children starving to death, the sight of food streaming out of the country was more than some could bear. On September 25th at Youghal, a crowd of country people, whom the police described as enraged, attempted to hold up a boat laden with oats for export. The police sent for troops, and the crowd was checked. 4 days later, menacing crowds in Dungarvan ordered merchants not to export grain. The first Royal Dragoons were called out, and after some stone throwing, opened fire. 2 were killed and several wounded. The first reaction of the government to the threat of violence was to introduce a Coercion Act, whereby the Lord Lieutenant could impose strict curfew and martial law. 17 Coercion Acts had been in operation in Ireland during the 46 years since the Act of Union. The new bill, however, as Lord Brougham remarked, possessed a superior degree of severity. In the wake of the disturbances in Youghal and Dungarvan, Trevelyan arranged for 2,000 troops, themselves well provisioned with beef, pork and biscuit, to be formed into mobile columns and directed at particular trouble spots at short notice. Every Tuesday, supplies of grain left here in Clonmel for export via Waterford. The grain was transported by barge on canal and river and was accompanied by an armed escort, 50 cavalrymen and 80 infantrymen. And of course, all around, thousands of people were dying of starvation. Whatever about economic niceties, the sight of food being exported while their children starved is something that the Irish people at the time found impossible to understand, and even more impossible to forget. Famine in Ireland was given as a reason for repealing the protectionist corn laws to allow the import of cheap grain. So it was in the interests of the landed gentry to deny there was a famine, or to say that if there was, it was grossly exaggerated, or at least due to other causes. The penny-a-week rent collected by Daniel O'Connell to finance the repeal movement was, according to Punch, the real potato blight in Ireland. The Corn Law controversy was conducted with frightful acrimony and party bitterness. At a critical juncture, Irish affairs took a back seat to burning domestic issues. The change in government which ensued meant the abandonment of some relatively enlightened policies and the substitution of laissez-faire, a policy which condemned 1 million people to die.
In no other country have men talked treason until they are hoarse, and then gone about begging sympathy from their oppressors. In no other country have the people been so liberally and unthriftily helped by the nation they denounced and defied.
Punch magazine, the light reading of the British ruling classes, is always a good guide to contemporary British feeling.
There is one thing I must beg of you to take into immediate consideration, which is, whatever may be the anger of people and Parliament in England, whatever may be the state of trade or credit, Ireland cannot be left to her own resources. They are manifestly insufficient, and we are not to let the people die of starvation.
The state of Ireland for the next few months must be one of great suffering. Unhappily, the agitation for repeal has contrived to destroy nearly all sympathy in this country.
In 1848, John Mitchell and Smith O'Brien undertook to stage a pathetic attempt at rebellion. The effect on British public opinion in perhaps the worst year of the famine is not hard to imagine.
I have no money. The safe and comfortable existence our rations have afforded the Irish, they have hardly been decent while they have their bellies full of corn and their pockets full of our money.
The great evil with which we have to contend is not the physical evil of the famine, but the moral evil of the selfish, perverse and turbulent character of the people.
They had a vision of the Irish peasant as a happy-go-lucky, easygoing individual who sat by the side of the road all day long, smoking a pipe, planted potatoes, worked for 1 or 2 days in the spring to plant potatoes, worked for 1 or 2 days in the autumn lifting the potatoes, and pretty well idled all the rest of the time. And they had no real perception of what life was really like in Ireland. The reality was that most of those peasants worked hard, they worked using very primitive technology, but there was a very intensive form of cultivation, very careful weeding, very careful manuring. I mean, potato yields in Ireland were much higher before the famine than they were up to relatively recently. There was a level of fertility achieved in that soil that it was quite extraordinary. Ireland before the famine fed 9.5 to 10 million people, 8.5 in Ireland, 1.5 million in England. Ireland during the Second World War had to import hundreds of thousands of tons of wheat, couldn't feed a population of, 3 million.
The Irish problem and overpopulation are one and the same, and being together beyond the power of man, the cure has been applied by the direct hand of an all-wise Providence in a manner as unexpected and as unthought of as it is likely to be effectual. We are in the hands of Providence, without the possibility of averting the catastrophe if it is to happen. We can only wait the result. It is hard upon the poor people that they should be so deprived of knowing that they are suffering from an affliction of God's providence.
Cecil Woodham Smith, an Englishwoman, wrote The Great Hunger, one of the classics on the Irish potato famine. In her concluding chapter, she tells how she found it impossible to read the letters of English statesmen of the period, like Sir Charles Wood or Trevelyan, for instance, without astonishment at the influence of antagonism and irritation on British government policy in Ireland. It's not characteristic, she wrote, for the English to behave like that. As a nation, the English have proved themselves capable of generosity, tolerance and magnanimity, but not where Ireland is concerned. And she concludes with a quotation from Sidney Smith, the celebrated English writer. The moment the very name of Ireland is mentioned, the English seem to bid adieu to common feeling, common prudence and common sense, and to act with the barbarity of tyrants and the fatuity of idiots.